So yeah, for those of you people watching at home, as I was just telling the room now, this is a museum and heritage group lecture, and they have normally one every month in certain points of the year really, but you can find much more about this on the website. I'll link it in below, because you have got links on websites now, because I did that the other day as well, so that's all good. So yeah, I'll put all the details in the description below, and you can come in person. This is one lecture that we're going to put online to entice you to join in this group really. So yeah, Evan Powell, and this is a photo of Evan. He was born in Merthyr Tydfil in 1881. Now, he was born in Merthyr Tydfil when Merthyr Tydfil was in a massive flux of change really, because employment and wealth was really spreading its way down the valley for a change, because for many, many decades the concentration of wealth, of employment, everything was on this top end of the valley. But then from around the 1860s, certainly the 1870s, the lower end of the valley was the one that was really developing in a big way, when the top end of the valley was kind of stumbling around the iron and steel industry. But the coal industry was kicking into a whole new gear. And so places like Aberfan and Treharris and all these places, they literally just cropped out of nowhere over a period of a couple of years in the latter part of the 19th. And that was the community he was born into. And so naturally he became a miner, and was a miner by the time he was around about 14. And so thankfully Evan is one of these few people that I can look back on and actually get a good whack of information about his life, because he bridged two gaps, the 19th and the 20th century in the early part, and it's quite easy in some respects to research a person in that time period. It's much harder to research a person who's alive now than it was back then. It's a nightmare finding out about anyone now. But anyway, this is a census from 1911. By his mid-30s, late 20s, mid-30s, that period, he had evolved up the ladder in the coal industry and become a clerk of the works, employed by Dowlais Iron Works, running various pits for them, and basically being a colliery clerk, as it says right there. But why this is important is it shows his address, which is a place that he stayed in for many years and grew up in this area, and it's literally the street that we're on, Brecon Road. And so yeah, he lived in this house, a 6-room house, so he was quite wealthy by this point, early, middle class, a very well paid good job, right? But many years before this, he started his way into what would make his story more unique than most really, and he detailed his own story many times publicly, mainly in the 1950s when he was a bit older, and he was having lots of interviews with press and other people because they were fascinated by the stories he had to tell. And so what I'm about to tell you is his version of his own upbringing really. This is exactly what he would tell groups and lecturers and talks, because he did all that. And this is Evan in his older days, in his obituary in 1958. So last of a great line of mediums. Now, not a great line of colliery clerks. Well, it was last in a great line of them. But yeah, so he was working underground one day, and literally he was under there with a friend, and all of a sudden, without warning, he grabs his friend and pulls him out to the tunnel they're working in. And then the tunnel collapses, and his friend then is just like, how did you know that was going to collapse? How did you know that was going to happen? And he was just like, I just had a feeling, I just had an inkling. And he couldn't quite put into words how he knew it was going to happen. But his friend was utterly convinced that Evan had shown an example of having like a sixth sight, a sixth sense of something ominous come in, and he saved his life, and he was incredibly grateful for that. And that was in 1895, that was 1894, 95, the latter part of 94, early part of 95. And so he's literally early teens, very young kid here, working underground, and he saved his friend's life. And so he gathered a little bit of a reputation in his group of friends then. And so some more time passes, and he's on Quarry Row with a friend. His friend on Quarry Row owns a shop, and above his shop they've got a room, and they decide one night to start experimenting with this newfangled thing that's come out of America really, spiritualism, and all the things that were tied in with that in terms of channeling the other side and things like that. And so they got together and tried to do a small seance. But Evan was a very religious man, and he kind of was opposed to it initially. He didn't want to be part of it. But then as he was part of this group, various things happened, which he wasn't too specific about what happened. But they discovered then that Evan was able to kind of have communication with the other side in some way, shape or form. And so they started then saying, oh look, you've got to go to this spiritualist church that started out on the tram road, down on the tram road in the Trevithick Memorial Hall. So you've got to go to that and see what happens, because you got something special about you. And so he went, attended the meeting, and then literally was in a trance for about an hour or so. He doesn't remember what happened, doesn't remember anything about it. But then when he comes to, he realizes that he's on the stage in the hall. And what happened, it transpires what happened, is Evan literally was there, and the speaker for that evening had cancelled. So there was no speaker, and then literally, without warning, he got up onto the stage and was talking to people and answering questions and channeling this and channeling that, and just blowing the audience away, and they didn't expect any of it. And he didn't really know what he was doing. It was very much automatic in his eyes. And so when he came to, he was just like, I don't know what I've said, what I've done, anything. But then what he did do there more than anything is the spiritualist church and the people around him at that time, and this was really early on in the formation of the spiritualist church for Merthyr, very early on, you know. And they essentially formed a group around him because they thought, you've got something that we would like to nurture. And so they formed a group around him, and every week they would meet and they would basically try to understand what was special about Evan in some way, shape and form. What they did is they would meet on a regular basis, and then slowly but surely, in around 1896, Evan started channeling different voices and messages through himself, without even having much knowledge after the fact of all this himself or anything like that. But what he said was, in so much time you will get a message from the other side. And he gave a specific time. Oh sorry, this was in 1895. He said, in a year's time from now, you will get a specific message from the other side. Keep meeting as you meet in, and keep showing your commitment, and in a year's time, you will have this cryptic message revealed, or whatever it was. And lo and behold, 1896 came, and Evan Powell wasn't just speaking as Evan Powell anymore. He was embodied with the spirit of a Native American Indian called Black Hawk. Now, we'll get back to that in a second, because there's tons of information I just shown you there, so we'll slow things down ever so slightly, because we even know for a fact the date that it happened, because Evan himself used to commemorate the date when he did lectures and seances and things like that, right up until 1958 when he died. So this being Evan J. Powell on August the 11th, 1946, in an audience, the audience were astonished to learn that it was actually the 50th anniversary to the day that he had his first spiritualist service with Powell, and this was the first occasion where this Black Hawk, this spirit guide, or again, I'm not or claim to be an expert on spiritualism and the techniques behind any of it, but literally this Native American was the one who was being channeled through him, and everything about Evan changed. From the voice to the language that he used, to his body language, to everything, right? And you're talking, I've heard Welsh people do accents, and most of them are terrible. They can't get rid of the Welsh accent. You can't do it. You can't do it. It's fixed. I'm joking. But in general, what you've got to realise is this, first and foremost, is a 15 to 16-year-old kid that's doing this, right? So this is literally you as, a 15, 16-year-old channeling this person through you, and talking in a way, and talking like a person that you would have never met or had any experience of ever before or anything like that. And so how he got to that is one of those kind of mysteries around Evan. Now Evan would go on, and he would really make such a gigantic impact on spiritualism and mediumship in Wales that I'm surprised that not more people know of him. And it may be more than anything to do with how this kind of movement of people, a religious movement, however you want to term it, is kind of more ridiculed and pushed to one side than any others, really, or most others anyway. And so, but Evan's story is amazing, and the things he did in his lifetime were amazing, and the people he influenced and the people he helped in many ways. And so what I wanted to do was give you an idea of what Evan evolved into after that initial seance. Because after that initial seance back in 1896, he started becoming what's called a cabinet medium. So a cabinet medium, you with the name you would instantly think that they're in some sort of wooden contraption, but normally it's a curtained area, really. So you would go into a curtained area of the room, you would set it up, and the chairs would be around you outside. And the idea would be is that you would be darkening and securing yourself off as much as possible for various things to happen. I think some mediums even say it offers some protection in some way, but again, I'm not an expert. But essentially he would be tied to a chair and in various ways as well. But Evan would, like I say, evolve into that, into his 20s. So he wasn't doing anything like this, early on in the 20th century. It was only as he grew up, which is a strange thing to happen because, and bear with me with this, because if, for example, you would think, naturally, if you want to be pessimistic, all right, he's a faker, he's a con man, all right? So he's earning money, he's a child trying to get out of the mines to earn money in a different way. You'd be right, maybe. But he was doing the majority of this work when he was a colliery clerk. He had earned that standing, and he had earned that job, and he had been promoted and was being paid better than most, and had no real need, really. He was out to the pits. He wasn't working underground by the time he was mid to late 20s. He was working as a colliery clerk. So that incentive doesn't seem to have been a thing. What seems to have been the main thing for Evan is that sheer belief in what he's doing. Is that sheer kind of drive that he is doing what he thinks is possible with himself and with his, I always fear saying powers, but you know what I mean. But in general, what happened in his late 20s, early 30s is he started doing these cabinet seances. And so if you were to go to one of these seances, what normally would happen is that Evan would be tied and bound to a chair, fingers and thumbs bound individually with different materials, sometimes cotton or thread or other things like that, double knotted, everything. Legs bound, thighs bound, waist bound, everything to a chair. Behind the curtain. Chairs in the room, different numbers of chairs depending on who's there. We'll get more specifics about the participants in a second. But in general, the people would be outside and he would be inside the cabinet. There would be musical instruments around, some in the cabinet, some outside the cabinet. Tambourines are mainly a big thing that we used in seances back in this period. But they would also just be the general objects that are in the room as well. And the room would be darkened, entirely darkened as much as humanly possible. The seance would start, and essentially what would happen then is things would begin to move, sounds would begin to be heard. So the tambourine, for example, would be hammered and smashed. A plant pot in the corner of the room would suddenly move around the room and would feel it on your lap or feel it above your head. Participants would feel hands or anything on their thighs and on their shoulders. They would feel like, coughing and people talking to them in their ear. There would be luminous lights that Evan Powell was apparently able to conjure within the room. And they would be visible to the people. They would literally illuminate the darkness in the space they were in. And not only that, Evan would channel not just this Black Hawk's voice, he would channel other voices and other accents and other languages as well. You're talking like Russian, Czechoslovakian, loads of different languages, and he would speak fluently in those languages as well. And so it was a real, mind opener for people, I think, in general, really, and it blew people away. Even went to the point where he'd have a conical kind of megaphone in the room, and he would paint it a luminous paint, okay? Because he knew that this would this would be able to shout their voice louder through, but it would move around the room as well and things like that. So he painted it luminous to give this effect of this thing is moving and all that. So imagine that chaos in this room. You know, tambourines are going, he's talking in different languages, there's blooming megaphones flying around the room with a luminous paint. There's tons of stuff going on. And that wasn't a one-off either. This happened time and time and time and time again. And this is why Evan gathered this reputation. Evan Powell then was literally gaining a massive reputation, particularly from about 1910 onwards, a gigantic reputation, a countrywide really. And not only was he gathering a massive reputation, spiritualism and the spiritualist movement overall was gaining a massive, massive reputation. It was growing like there is no tomorrow. It was growing into such a gigantic movement in Britain that I can't believe that it's not as gigantic now, to be honest, because there were so many people fully committed and enthralled and dedicated to it. And one of those people being Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Now, Arthur Conan Doyle, obviously the author of Sherlock Holmes and many other books, he was going through the motions of being fully convinced and fully on the board with spiritualism as a movement, really. He says himself outright, I'm skeptical of it. I've been investigating it since about 1883, he says in his writings. He's been investigating it and looking at it from a scientific, logical point of view, okay? And by the time he was coming to Merthyr in February 15th, 1919, he was doing a lecture around the country called Death and the Hereafter. And this was a build-up to a variety of different publications that he was writing. And what he was trying to do is he was trying to fully understand and grasp spiritualism and try to make a logical argument towards how we should use it, how we should not be afraid of it. Because people in Merthyr, for example, were saying that people who did this type of thing were the devil. And it was, horrendous, and people were pushing them to one side, and really, honestly, you'd be amazed at the amount of animosity that there was towards the spiritualist movement back in places like Merthyr. And so the spiritualist church in Merthyr, Evan being a part of that church, invited Sir Arthur Conan Doyle to come to Merthyr. Obviously, there was some monetary gain there. Merthyr was still a very populated town. They could put on a nice, healthy, well-attended event. And so Arthur Conan Doyle came to Merthyr in February 1919, and he gave his talk in the Theatre Royal, as you can see there. Now, he did that talk and came to Merthyr, and everyone was then buzzing about this. And he was doing the same all over the country, because it's such a gigantic thing that you can kind of underestimate it. That this guy, who wrote the most logical, level-headed character in literature, is now saying spiritualism is real and we should be looking at it and we should be exploring it. Having that person on your side with that movement is a big, big thing. It really is. And so when he came to Merthyr, you would think, he must have met Evan, and Evan and him must have got on like a house on fire. Not the case. They seemingly didn't meet at all. And he seemingly didn't meet another guy who was responsible for bringing him here in the first place as well, a gentleman called Harry Southey. Now, Harry Southey ran the Merthyr Express, and he was bringing him to Merthyr as well, because he was part of the spiritualist church as well. But Harry Southey was ill. Evan Powell seems to have been possibly in attendance, but not there afterwards. And Arthur Conan Doyle left Merthyr. Came, left, caused an uproar, then walked away basically. But he would do the same again later on that year. And so this is from the light, December 27, 1919, okay? So the end of that year that he came to Merthyr. He came to Merthyr in February, this is the end of that year. What happened in between him coming to Merthyr the first time and him coming to Merthyr the second time, which he did twice in 1 year, was he met Evan Powell. But not in Merthyr Tydfil, down by the sea in Portsmouth. And so what they were doing is there was a big, large debate, an event really, in Portsmouth. And everyone who was part of the spiritualist movement was going there to hear lectures, to speak to other people, to exchange ideas, to exchange thoughts. It was essentially there to bring all these different spiritualist churches and movement and people and mediums together in one place. Arthur Conan Doyle was there with his wife, and when they were there, a friend said, you have to have a seance with Evan Powell. He's going to absolutely blow your mind. It's amazing. And so he was like, yeah, okay, that's fine. And so after Arthur Conan Doyle had finished talking, and after Evan Powell had finished kind of talking and doing whatever he was doing on that day, they went to Arthur Conan Doyle's bedroom in the hotel. They went in, Arthur Conan Doyle tied Evan Powell to a chair, got loads of different strings, and this article goes into detail. There's about a paragraph and a half of him tying him up. Literally like every little bit, tying every little bit up. And the same little tropes come in as well that Evan had been using in previous seances. You know, he had that megaphone with a luminous paint, he had the tambourines, he had his little cabinet that he put around him. But again, he's in Arthur Conan Doyle's bedroom. You know, he hadn't been in this room before or anything like that. And so they set up, and it was Arthur Conan Doyle and Jean, and pretty much that's it, really. And this seance literally changed Arthur Conan Doyle's life. And that's no understatement whatsoever on any level. This literally changed the entire trajectory of the rest of his life. Because what happened in this seance is Evan Powell was able to communicate directly with Kingsley. Kingsley, who was the dead son of Arthur Conan Doyle, who had died during World War I. Black Hawk embodied Evan, his voice changed, he was talking to Arthur Conan Doyle. Arthur Conan Doyle writes himself, he said there was a gigantic plant pot in the corner of the room, and literally it was hovering over my head. I could feel it and touch it, it was hovering over my head. And then, as all these weird things were happening around, then a voice came from Evan Powell. And Arthur Conan Doyle's wife instantly went, Kingsley, shouted that name out. And they then started having a discussion then, having a talk between father and son. And there was this whole back and forth, and for a long time, for a good few months, Arthur Conan Doyle wouldn't mention, from September to December, he wouldn't talk about this. But because a lot of people were casting aspersions on spiritualism, he decided to put the most convincing argument down on paper that had convinced him to follow the spiritualist movement, really. And that was his seance with Evan Powell and his communication with his son. From then on in, you can pretty much definitively say, really, that Evan Powell was the personal medium for Arthur Conan Doyle. And pretty much the only reason that Arthur Conan Doyle came back to Merthyr twice in a year. Arthur Conan Doyle came back, this time he was in the drill hall, December the 2nd, 19, so 2 weeks or so before he wrote that article I just showed you, detailing his first encounter with Evan. He came, and he put the lecture on in the drill hall, The Evidence of Immortality. And it was much the same as what he had discussed earlier on in the year. But he was using these first-hand accounts now, because what happened to Arthur Conan Doyle is when he started talking about life and the hereafter and death and the hereafter and whatever, and touring the country doing that lecture, everywhere he went, he was having a seance with people and having experiences. So by the end of the year, he'd had more seances than anyone else in the world ever. He was well accustomed to it all by then. And so he was using that referencing material and those events to inform this talk, really. He even actually had another seance with a group called guy called William Thomas, the Thomas brothers they called them, and they lived in Merthyr in Pendarren for a while, but he did a seance with them in Cardiff. But that's another story altogether. The best looking medium ever, apparently, William Thomas. Looked like a stout footballer, and everyone was shocked that he was a medium because he was so big and handsome, apparently. But yeah, Arthur Conan Doyle came back, drill hall, and afterwards he literally was like, Evan, you are giving me another seance without the shadow of a doubt. That's the only reason I'm here. That's the only reason I've been enticed to come back here. Let's go and get that done. And so that's exactly what they did. And that is Evan, by the way, around the same time as we are talking about. This is him in 1923, so that's pretty much him as close to the date as of Arthur's seances that we can get, really. And this is where they retired to for this seance. House is still standing, just on the bottom end of the Gurnas, wall around it. It's an amazing house inside as well. It really is a lovely house, but it has changed a lot since this photo was taken. But this is the Southey Villa, and this was the point in time where Southey was outright, this is my calling now. I have to make spiritualism world known and world respected. Literally, this was the first seance with Evan Powell convinced him to change his life, but the second one literally decided and pushed him on a path to literally travel the world and spread the good word of spiritualism. And weirdly enough, the whole story appears in Arthur Conan Doyle's own books. It's called The Wanderings of a Spiritualist, and this book was written on the back of Arthur Conan Doyle's world tour, where he was going around the world talking to people about spiritualism, experiencing spiritualist church and mediums from all over the world, in Australia and everywhere, in America, getting in lots of problems and arguments with Houdini, which we'll get to. The opening chapter of this book, chapter 1, he outlines what inspired him to go. And chapter 1 is entitled The Merthyr Séance. Literally, he tells you all you need to know. I don't even need to tell you, you can read it for yourselves. But there is one memorable night when walking forth with my head throbbing and my whole frame quivering from the villa of Mr. Southey at Merthyr. Behind me the brazen glare of Dowless ironworks lit up the sky, and in front twinkled the many lights of the Welsh town. For 2 hours my wife and I had sat listening to the whisperings of voices of the dead, voices which are so full and earnest life and desperate and of desperate endeavours to pierce the barrier of our dull senses. They had quivered and wavered around us, given us pet names, sweet sacred things, the intimate talk of the olden time. Graceful lights, signs of spirit power had hovered over us in the darkness. It was a different, wonderful world. Now, with those voices still haunting our memories, we all slipped out into the material world with the glaring ironworks and twinkling cottage windows. As I looked down on all, I grasped Jean's hand, and he cried, "My God, how can they not know?" And that's what he cried, and that set him off on his journey then. Literally, the rest of the book is him saying, I'm only going on this journey because of this experience and the two experience with Evan Powell, really. It really did fire him up on all cylinders. This perhaps kind of gives another slant, doesn't it? This is a person who's looking into the history of spiritualism, and was published in The Light in November 1934. And they said it was through Mr. Evan Powell's mediumship that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle received his most convincing proofs and research work, and spiritualism is the poorer that his mediumship is not available today, because he had retired to a certain degree only on personal levels. And yet he really utterly convinced on every level, a guy who'd been looking into spiritualism from the early 1880s right up until that kind of point in 1919, convinced him to totally and utterly change the course of his life. When I was looking into this story, you find many miners around Merthyr, many stories of miners, but very rarely do you find a miner who not only had the wherewithal and the commitment to become a clerk to the works and be very well paid when coming from a very working class background, great on its own, but then having him then raised to this level of becoming a personal medium to pretty much one of the world's most famous authors is totally and utterly unique to Merthyr's history. There isn't another story like this. We've got tons of Iron Masters which you'll hear endlessly about, mainly from me in fairness, but Evan's story is really, really unique. But there is one point in this story that he did my head in. And that's the point that I'll tell you about now, because it would be totally, utterly ignorant and stupid of me if I did ignore this point, because it's so blatantly obvious. Many years into his spiritualism career, he was obviously being embodied by this character, by this spirit of Black Hawk. And several years into his career, other people started going and talking to Evan saying, I wonder if this guy if this spirit is real, if we can trace him. And then in another seance, Black Hawk told one of the people present that there was a book on his life, that there was a book that he had wrote on his life and experiences. And the guy was like, that's amazing. And Evan coming out didn't know he'd said it, obviously, because he's like, oh, what? And the guy was saying, oh yeah, you said that Black Hawk said that he wrote a book. He said, weirdly, I'm going to America in 3 months' time, so I went on my travels through America, I look to see if I can find this book. And bizarre, he found this book. And so he found this book years later, and this is, into the early 1920s you're talking this about now, right? So he found that book, brought it back, and used that as evidence to say that, look, Evan actually knew of this guy. Like, how could he know of this existence? This book was a nightmare for me to find. I found it in a backwater thrift shop in America, and it's real, and everything in this book is what Evan Powell has told us in seances. How could a boy from Merthyr possibly know this? That's the problem, is he could have, because it was serialized in a local paper, which is annoying to say the least, because when you're looking through all of this history of that and looking at Evan's life, you kind of, I did anyway, I can only speak from my personal kind of experience with it. I was always of the mindset that Evan was fully and utterly convinced by his abilities and was not doing any type of trickery or wrongness or anything like that. Like, it was an unconscious thing more than anything, because I'm not a believer in that way. So but I equally didn't think negatively of him. I thought that he was doing a lot of the things he was doing unconsciously, for example. But again, not an expert. But then I found this, and it kind of almost sullied the whole story for me. This is a book called The Magician Among Spirit, a great Houdini, one of the biggest spiritualist busters, if you want to put it like that, ever born. And he would write this book, and he was outraged and deeply offended by the spiritualist movement, because he saw it all as trickery, whether conscious trickery or not. And he would write the book on how the people doing it are doing what they're doing, and why the people believe in it are believing it. And so he was basically dissecting and pulling apart all the different strands of spiritualism and trying to get across look, this isn't reality, this isn't happening, this is a trick, a technique here, look, I can do this, I can do that. And so he wrote a book, and in his book he used Evan Powell and Evan Powell's meeting with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle as reference to various things to help him disprove spiritualism by talking about Arthur Conan Doyle's experiences. Now, Arthur Conan Doyle and Houdini were good friends. They'd met several times, and Arthur Conan Doyle would always try to convince Houdini that people like Evan Powell are real and genuine, and he was closing his mind off when he shouldn't be closing his mind off. Evan Powell would go on and on and on and on and do seances all over the place, really, for many, many years. He would eventually, in the early 1930s, get to a point where he's only doing personal seances, but he still was certainly out there and giving lectures as well. And so good Evan Powell had come down for a last seance, and I had the joy of the last few words with my arisen son, who blessed me on my mission and assured me that I would indeed bring solace to the bruised hearts around the world, because he was genuinely, utterly convinced, and so was Evan for that matter, that they were bringing one major thing to people. They were helping to ease those bruised hearts more than anything. This was written by Arthur Conan Doyle just before he went around the world, and he would come back time and time again. When he came back, he would almost immediately organise a seance in his house with Evan Powell, invite everyone round, and everyone would be blown away by these moving lights, by everything. But either way, I will stop going on and on about Evan Powell and all that now. But needless to say, he died down in Devonshire. He moved out of Merthyr in the mid-1920s and essentially started his own business, his own colliery business down in Devonshire, but was still pretty much going back and forth to Arthur Conan Doyle's house up until the time when Arthur Conan Doyle died, which I've just forgotten, early 1930s, 32 I think. They can correct me online if I'm wrong with that. I'll put a caption if I'm wrong. But yeah, he was massively, a partner in life with him after that 1919 meeting. There's no proof whatsoever that Arthur Conan Doyle's medium, Evan Powell, was a fraud on any level at all. You know, I mentioned the black oak stuff earlier, but that's just one aspect of many, many things that he was doing during a seance. And yeah, I would find out for yourself. Go and look up Evan Powell and see if you can find some more, but I'll shut up now anyway. But thank you very much for listening. Any questions, by all means throw them my way, but hopefully you've enjoyed listening for a bit. Thank you very much.